Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexey, and today I have a special guest, Chris Baseford. Chris is a rock and metal sound engineer who has been working with such great bands as Nickelback, Rap Zombie, Avril Lavigne, and many more. Also, Chris has a mixing course on Nail the Mix, where he shows how he mixed San Quentin's song by Nickelback. So, if you want to learn from Chris how to mix Nickelback on a good level, you can always join Nail the Mix, the best online community on producing, mixing and mastering rock and metal music. All links will be in the info box of this video. Thank you so much, Chris, for being on my YouTube channel. It's a huge honor to me. And let's start our interview. And my first question is how you became a sound engineer.
The quick and dirty answer to that was I've always been interested in music, and when I started playing in bands when I was, I don't know, maybe like 13 or 14 years old, as a guitar player, I was always kind of the guy in the band who was always trying to tweak the sound and get the sound as good as it could be. And then eventually, when we started making demo tapes, I'd be the guy that really liked to, go and rent some equipment and work on making our recording sound really good. Whereas some of the other guys in the band were more interested in like playing live shows and doing that kind of thing. I was more interested in the kind of the recording and the sound and the production of that. So I already kind of gravitated towards that before I really knew that that's kind of what my career was going to be. And I've told this story before, but when I was probably about 14 years old, I saw a friend of mine's brother had a video of a year and a half in the making of, which is the Metallica movie of when they made the Black Album. And when I watched that for the first time, I'd pretty much decided then and there that seeing Bob Rock and Randy Staub produce and record that album, that's basically kind of what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So from pretty much that point on, it was all about, figuring out a way to get to that point.
So my next question is how you got into mixing rock and metal music.
Well, that was just kind of a natural evolution of obviously, that was the music that I liked to listen to. My favorite albums were big rock albums. And that was kind of the music that I was interested in, not only when I was a kid, but still to this day. And kind of getting into engineering, even when you're recording, you're also kind of mixing at the same time because you got to make it sound good to everybody in the room and the producer you're working for. And so ultimately, it's just kind of a natural evolution of the recording and the production process is then kind of the mix, the mix process. When I first started, I didn't really, I was always more interested in kind of becoming a full-time producer. And I think ultimately what ended up happening was, with the technology being a lot of it's now in the computer, by the time you get the production finished, you've already kind of gotten the mix 3/4 of the way there. So it just kind of ended up turning into, again, a scenario of evolving of the process of, you get to the end of the recording process, the production process, and then it's a matter of, finishing the mix. And then that ultimately showed me that I actually really like mixing. So just to kind of break up the monotony of producing records, I also mix for other people. So and also people would hear my productions, or they would hear my mixes, or producers would hear my mixes from my productions, and then or hear my rough mixes and then hire me to mix their other stuff as well. So kind of evolved from recording and producing.
So my next question is how you started working with Nickelback.
I started working with Nickelback based off of my previous work that I'd done with Chad Kroeger. Aside from Nickelback, I met Chad several years before working with Nickelback. Whenever he would come to LA, he would often use the recording studio that I worked out of to record, whether if he was songwriting with another artist or recording some stuff for himself, but in LA. And so I developed a little bit of a working relationship with Chad just every 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 months, depending on when he was in LA, just seeing him, working with him, developing a little bit of rapport. And probably, I can't remember what year it was, but he was working on an Avril Lavigne record. And he called me kind of out of the blue. They needed an engineer to come help finish recording vocals for her album. And so I then went and did that with them and ended up spending quite a bit of time working with Chad again on a kind of a more regular basis. And then when that album was done, him and the guys were starting a new Nickelback album, which was that was the No Fixed Address album. And so he invited me to come and work on that with them. And that just kind of turned into, I think that was over 10 years ago. So yeah, we've kind of been working a lot together, and me and Chad do other productions as well together outside of Nickelback as well. So we do quite a bit of work together.
So my next question is, what do you use for Chad Kroeger's vocal recordings? In this case, what kind of mics do you use, and what kind of analog gear do you use for his vocals recording?
So this last album, we used the Townsend Labs Sphere mic, which is like a modeling mic. We used that for the microphone. We plugged that into Vintech X81 mic pre's, no EQ, nothing, just kind of straight in. And then the rest of the processing is done in the box. On previous albums, we've used SM7s, work really well on Chad. I'm trying to remember. There was one album, I think it might have been No Fixed Address. We were traveling around a lot, and so we had a very streamlined setup. So that album, almost all of the vocals, I think, was the SM7 into the Avid Omni, just built-in mic pre's, no compression, no EQ, just straight in. And it's funny because a lot of people have commented on some of the vocals on that album about how great they sound. And then when I tell people how simple the setup is, they don't believe me sometimes. But yeah, with Chad, Chad's got a great voice. The biggest challenge recording him is just he's very loud. So it kind of limits our options with microphones. I have to be able to pick something that can take all of the level, without with still providing like a full bodied signal, frequency wise. So that's where the SM7 comes in handy. And then the Sphere, the Townsend Labs Sphere mic's awesome because I can get more of like a U47 or a 251 sound, but it can take a lot more SPL than those mics can. So I can capture the source, the loud source, and then use the model after.
What tips can you give on mixing rock vocals?
Mix tips on rock vocals. Well, it's obviously very context dependent. Like it depends on what the song is and what the other instrumentation is doing and what the voice is. Like Chad has got a very loud, very mid-range, heavy voice. He's got lots of harmonics. His voice is actually very, even though it's a lot of mid-range, it's very full. So that I would treat completely different than I would treat, let's say, like, a singer whose voice is a lot cleaner, or maybe tends to be a little bit more scooped or a little more nasally. Like you have to treat it differently based off of what the sound of the singer is, and then also how it's fitting in the music. But I guess one of the biggest things that I would say can help a rock vocal sit in a mix is trying not to treat the mid-range too statically. And when I say that, I often talk about EQing a vocal. EQing a vocal is tough because if a singer is singing, let's say down here, he's singing, you're going to EQ it a lot differently than if he's like yelling or if he's a higher register. And so what a lot of people do is they'll EQ the vocal and then it just stays like that for the entire song. When in one verse, you might have like 5 different vocal sounds because he's going, the singer's going through the different ranges, or he's quiet, or he's loud, or he's got rasp in his voice, or he's clean. Like the voice is so dynamic. It's the most dynamic instrument in my opinion. So EQing it where you just set it and leave it is very difficult for me. I find I might EQ it on one line and then it doesn't sound that good on the next line, and then I'll EQ it on that one, and now the line before doesn't sound good. So I like to automate EQs. I like to use multi-band compressors, dynamic EQs, that type of thing, to really help only EQ the stuff that needs to be EQ'd. So that's probably the biggest thing. That was a big breakthrough for me when I realized one of the problems that I always had was just getting the vocal to sit right, is trying to get the EQ to be the same for everything. And it's really doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it.
So my next question is, how do you record huge drums for Nickelback? Or in this case, how do you make drums sound huge for Nickelback?
Well, I mean, we use a lot of different techniques. I mean, with pretty much everything I do, but obviously with the Nickelback stuff. Daniel, the drummer, first of all, he's an amazing player, which helps. He hits the drum in such a way where the drum resonates and the drum doesn't sound choked, and it sounds big when he hits it. Like, I'm not a drummer. I get up there and I'll hit, I'll be hitting a drum, in the studio, and it will sound a certain way. And then a good drummer goes and hits it, and all of a sudden the thing comes to life. So, I mean, that's the first thing. He's also very, he's got a good ear for picking drums that sound good. And he's got a lot of drums that do sound really nice. He's got his own drum room at his house where we can set up, and he can leave everything set up. So that way we can punch in fills, let's say a week after, he does the drum tracks. Or what we'll often do is, he'll be almost the last person to play on the song. We'll use program drums up until when the song's kind of done, and then he'll play on it. So we can tune the sounds for the track, which is nice, as opposed to having to guess what the song is going to sound like at the end. Two really big things that kind of make up what I try to do when I'm producing a big rock band or mixing. We record a lot of ambient mics, so we have a lot of room mics, and then there's a bunch of different things you can do with those during the mix process to help give you that big size. Not only the sonic sound of a room, but it can also give you some depth and some width that close mics obviously can't give you. And then probably the most obvious thing is I'm not shy of using big drum samples. So, typically live drums, even a great sounding kit in a great sounding room with a great sounding drummer, I like to enhance with samples just to make everything bigger and brighter and more low end, and it also just gives you more control. So, if you want to really EQ something aggressively or compress something aggressively, you can have that control with a sample where you're dealing with bleed, and you're dealing with restrictions of where you can put microphones. Like, for instance, if you're sampling a drum kit, if you're sampling a snare drum, you can put a microphone, 8 feet above the snare drum and then compress the crap out of it to give you a sound. You can't do that when you're recording a live drum kit, because you're going to have so many cymbals in that mic and so many other things in that mic that all of a sudden now you don't have the control that you do with a sample. So I'm not shy about using samples. It's just another tool in the toolkit. And I mean, Nickelback, obviously, and a lot of the other bands that I mix and produce for, I'll use samples all over the place. So that's another another way to get to that end result.
What tips can you give on mixing rock drums?
So that's kind of another thing, kind of like the vocals. It's very dependent on what the material is and what the sound is. Even the tempo of the song. I'll mix drums differently if the song's kind of slower than if it's faster. You can't have as much, low end information going on, or it just gets muddy when the song's a little bit faster or the kick drum's busier. But ultimately, the thing with mixing drums in a big dense rock song is picking the right sounds is a big thing. And that's another thing that samples help with. Like, you can record a live drum kit, but until you hear the whole thing kind of mixed, you might not know what frequency the snare drum really needs to fill. And then at that point, if you've got this little pocket of mid-range that the snare drum can fit in nicely and fit with the guitars and the vocal, sometimes you can make the live snare fit into that, but sometimes just putting a sample to kind of give you that frequency range can help. A lot of for me, a lot of mixing big drums is carving out a lot of the garbage in the drums that you don't need frequency wise. So for instance, if there's harsh mid-range in the overheads, carving that stuff out. If there's a boxiness to the snare drum, carving that out. If there's a woofiness to the kick drum, carving that out. And unlike vocals, where the EQ curve is always kind of changing with drums, a snare drum, every time you hit it, ideally, that EQ should work on every drum, on every snare hit, because the snare hit should be relatively consistent. So, you can kind of get aggressive with EQ and carve stuff out, and it will work hopefully throughout the rest of the track. And then the other thing I like, talking about samples and talking about recording drums, I also like using ambient samples quite a bit. So in addition to, close mic samples or just one-shot samples that are pre-processed, I also like using really, really, really long ambient room samples and then gating them down and tailoring the tails to kind of fit the space of the song. And that changes so drastically depending not only on the song, the production, the tempo, the key, like everything, but really filling that space and giving the drums some size and dimension with some ambience.
So my next question is, how do you create a guitar tone for Nickelback?
It's Nickelback has such, I don't want to say like they have such an identifiable guitar tone, because it changes from album to album, but they have kind of like an aesthetic that I think people already associate their songs with. So I don't deviate too far from that. But it's really not, we really don't overthink it that much. Right now, over the last couple albums, the majority of the guitar tones have been from the Fractal Axe effects. And, I've got a bunch of presets that I like in that. There's a bunch of cabinet IRs that I like, some that are built in, some that I've bought, some that I've made. And it's really a matter of just kind of finding the right sound for the part. The majority of kind of our starting points is kind of like a Mesa rectifier kind of sound. And then it's a matter of, picking the right guitar for the part. And then just doing some small changes, if you need to carve out some mid-range, if you need to add some low end, depending on the part. If it's a low tuned part with power chords, maybe you don't need as much low end. If it's a single note riff, maybe you want a little bit more low end. But again, it's kind of just tailoring it for the part and for the guitar, and really not overthinking it too much. It's, I think, most of us have made enough records, and we know kind of what we like. So it's just a matter of kind of trial and error, of finding something that is inspiring, but that also fits the song, and that, when Chad or Ryan are playing, that it feels good to them while they're playing and inspires them and gets them excited about the song that we're making.
Do you use virtual guitar amps for guitars production? And what is your opinion on using virtual guitar amps?
Yeah, like I said, we just we use the Fractal a lot on the last couple albums, and I personally I think like anything else, they're another tool, and I use them a lot. I think they've gotten so good that the benefits of the benefits of virtual guitar amps, I feel like outweigh the potential detriment. For instance, when I'm working with Nickelback, a lot of the time we're writing the song as we're producing the song. So we may get a chorus of a song one day and then get the verse 2 weeks later. And even if you've got your guitar amp set up and nobody's touching the microphones and nobody's touching any of the settings, it's so difficult to reliably get the same sound out of a guitar amp that's been mic'd up if you're coming back to it a month later. So being able to have the recallability, being able to have, if we tweak the sound just a little bit for a certain part, I can save that as a new preset, and then I can jot that number down in my Pro Tools session. So if we ever need to punch in, or if we ever need to change a chord or rewrite a riff, or if we write a bridge section for a song that we recorded 4 months ago, it's very easy for me to do. And sonically, I've done a lot of A/B comparing with, Fractals, Kempers, even some of the plugins now. Like I've got my Diesel plugin with ML Sound Labs, and I mean we spent months A/Bing that against my Diesel VH4, and got to a point where, within the context of a production. Even sometimes, even just like, drums, bass, and a guitar, like you couldn't pick out which one was the real amp and which one was the simulator. So for me, it's another tool, and it helps the technical process get out of the way of the creative process, because I'm not worried about, is that guitar sound the same, or did the microphone get moved, or is the preamp, the preamp level set the same? Or if somebody wants a different sound, I don't have to say, okay, wait 10 minutes while I go set up another amp. Like I can just start clicking through and grab a different sound. So to me, like I said, when you're objectively looking at it through the lens of a producer, it facilitates the production process so much better than having to deal with, heads and cabinets and tubes and microphones and, cabling that one day works and the next day doesn't. So to me, I'm a big fan. I've been a proponent of the modeling amps for a long time, and man, they're so good right now that I just don't see. I still like using real amps, but it's more about finding a project that, if you're recording all the guitars for, the album in a week, yeah, you can set up guitar amps and go. But in a project like with the Nickelback guys, where it's months and months and months of revisiting songs, it just doesn't work.
What gear do you use for recording bass?
Bass. Again, it's nothing too crazy. I mean, finding a good clean DI, which these days is not hard. I mean, most of the high end interfaces have a really good DI. I like the DI on the Fractal. I think on the majority of the stuff that I record, I usually take 2 DIs. I'll usually take one like super clean, either like straight through the Fractal or straight into my interface or one of my mic pre's. And then I'll take another DI that usually has some sort of additional processing, whether it be, like a preamp pedal with some distortion, or one of the DIs that we used on this last Nickelback album was the new radial DI, which has some built-in like compressor and a little bit of tone shaping stuff. So we use that a lot as well. So I'll take both and then decide kind of in the mix process what I like better, or find the mix. And the other thing that I really like is I'll pretty much just about always duplicate the clean DI, and I'll run a Sans amp plugin on that, and have that running alongside both DIs. And between those 3 signals, I can kind of get just about whatever I need to get.
How to create a good low end in rock music?
The $1 million question. There's no easy answer for that. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet for finding that one. Ultimately, you got to use your ears, and you gotta make space, and carving out low end that doesn't need to be there in certain instruments. having one of the things that I like to do is have trigger the low end of let's say the bass guitar off the kick, so there's a little bit of push pull with the low end. So when the kick hits, the low end on the bass guitar kind of sucks out for a second, and then when the kick's not hitting, the low end from the bass is filling that in. But ultimately, it's one of those things that's so dependent. It's so content and context dependent on where everything else is. But the biggest thing that I probably see with a lot of people is like they've just got too much going on in the low end. I think ultimately most people would be better. Most like rough mixes that I hear or mixes from other other musicians or producers that send me their stuff to mix, when it comes to me, there's typically just a lot of low end buildup that you just have to kind of get a little aggressive with and start carving out, decide where your low end is coming from, and then figuring out a way to kind of piece that puzzle together using all the tools that you have.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for
You're
taking your
welcome.
time. It was a huge honor talking to you. And a huge thanks for your Nail the Mix session on mixing Nickelback, because I learned so much from watching this session. And thanks so much for everything.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.